So welcome back, everybody. We are very happy that you're coming here now for season number 2 of our webinar series. And we're very happy to have Jean Tirole with us, who will talk about public and private sphere and the authentic self. Hi, Jean.
Hi, Markus. Thank you for invitation.
It's great to have you here. So we have made some changes. We did some surveys among you, and we made some changes in our setup. So we cover a more broader topic, not only COVID related. And before I start with my introductory remarks, let me give a few housekeeping recordings. So we will now meet every Thursday at 12:30 New York time. And there are some upcoming speakers for the next Thursdays. So next Thursday, Esther Duflo will talk. And then Esteban Rossi Hansberg will talk about climate change the subsequent week. And then the week afterwards, Chris Sims will talk about how to worry about government debt, how we should worry. It's clear that we should worry. And then finally, we have the next speaker is Bengt Holmström. He will talk about seasonal COVID. But today we have Jean Tirole talking about the private and public sphere. And I would like to give you some perspective from before Jean takes over. So on privacy, I think many people, when they think from an economic perspective on privacy, should we keep everything private or some aspects private? They think about information rent or consumer rent. So, for example, you should not pass all information on to companies because otherwise the consumer rent is going away. On the other hand, if you pass more information on to the companies, they can have a better recommender system, as we know from Netflix and other companies that recommend good products to you, but they of course take the information rent away from the customers. But here there's a different component. There's the private sphere, and you can be more authentic in your private sphere. Do you sacrifice if you open up your private sphere? I would like to give another dimension to it with connecting privacy with brainstorming in a sense. So in a private sphere, you're around people you know very well, and you feel much more comfortable to say random things which are very useful to brainstorm and come up with new ideas. Because using some economic language, your friends and people who are familiar with you, they are very tight priors about you. So you don't have to worry to signal something very crazy to them. And you're very free to think, and you're bold in your brainstorming and openly, and that fosters creativity. Because you're not worried you might distort your self-image when you do that. And this might overcome, in a private sphere, also other cancel culture and other things which are typically you might be very concerned about. And I think this is very, very important, in particular, in industries where creativity is very important and we have to have new innovations and private space to brainstorm freely without being worried that somebody else will distort your self-image, or you will distort your self-image on your own, is actually a very important component. Another important component for privacy is that you're free to plot a revolution or a revolt. That's, might be an out of equilibrium phenomenon that it might not happen, but just the threat of being able to do this is actually keeping the government on their toes. And this might be a useful thing also for democracy to some extent. And there might be an optimal level to what extent you can do that. So in this sense, I think privacy is very, very important to keep this also other dimensions beyond information rent and consumer rent. And I think Jean will talk about these aspects further today. So on the other hand, we have the public sphere where everything is very open. There's a large group, social media and all this. I would like to connect it a little bit to the public sphere. Jürgen Habermas, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th and 21st century, is famous for this public sphere. And in his perspective, it's the institutional arrangement which determine how people interact and how they arrive at the consensus. And the consensus truth, essentially, or consensus beliefs. And that's very, very important that we have a society where we can actually reach a consensus, and we have a public sphere where we can interact. So in the 19th century, this was the coffee houses where the public sphere happened and determined essentially the overall view of society. And I think that's very, very important to have this public sphere going on. And the question is a little bit, it's now shifting towards social media, or it has shifted already. And how will this public sphere change? And will it change democracies? Will it change all our consensus finding? And you see that society is drifting apart along certain dimensions. So we have to find a structure to get more consensus finding again back. And that's essentially a big, big challenge for our societies. And that's, you know, where you can bring Jürgen Habermas' insights into the picture. And that's, I mean, of course, one of the most important aspects and challenges we face, our society faces. So if I put it in perspective, what we have here is essentially a shift from a private to a public sphere more generally. And here I just wrote down the evolution, perhaps a little bit more extreme in a sense. So we started out by communicating essentially through sound and voices. Then script allowed us to communicate even across generations because we can, you know, maintain the script across generations. The printing press made everything very broadly available. Now we have social media and face recognition. And soon we will have brain-to-brain links with Neuralink. And there are some critical comments saying, okay, we have some millions or 1,000 connectors from brain to brain. Right now it's only from pig to pig in a sense. But of course, in each brain, we have 86 billion neurons. So there's still a long way to go. But there will be a much better way to connect my thoughts to somebody else's thoughts down the road. And is there a danger that I have to worry way more about my self-image when others see what I'm thinking? Or is it still the case that I'm free to think, that I can have some secret thoughts and strategize and think about that? Is this a challenge, and how will society change? And this will be dramatic changes. It might take some decades or not, but these are things we really have to think about from a philosophical perspective. And I think that's something we should worry about as well in economics, and perhaps use our modeling approach to get that. And there will be a tech elite who can probably measure our inner feelings. And this gives the tech elite at least two advantages. One, they get an information advantage, but they also have a huge advantage to design this public sphere. So how will it be designed? How will we find consensus? And that's a huge advantage they have. And the question is, who should have this advantage? Should it be debated in the society? And I wish there were more debates. And I think Jean Tirole's presentation today can contribute to this debate we actually need, rather than leaving it just to the tech elite. So the whole society should actually debate that. And to the extent they can read and measure our feelings, there are certain feelings we cannot control. It comes from the limbic system and the inner part of our brains. Then the elites, they will just have some informational advantage. And there's some other feelings which we might be able to control, perhaps some phase aspects we can controlled by the prefrontal cortex or something else. Then we will change our behavior. And then the tech elites can also change essentially our behavior, because we will be very careful to do certain things, because otherwise we will reveal something. So there's a benign perspective to say, okay, in the future, we cannot have all the principal agent problems, all the asymmetric information problems will be gone, because everybody can just read what I'm thinking. I cannot pretend to be a different type I actually am. But there's also a less benign perspective where actually the information advantage is with a few technological advanced companies and not with society at large. And these are many interesting questions which come up, and I would say one of the most important questions of our times, and Jean will address them. So let me just, before I pass on the floor or the screen, the virtual floor to Jean, let me just summarize what the poll outcomes were. So we had a little poll said, is there a trade-off between privacy and influence? If you give up your privacy, you might have more influence in public life, and actually 80% and more thought, you know, that's the case. About human behavior, is it mostly driven by extrinsic motivation, like monetary awards and incentives, or intrinsic motivations, because you want to be a good person? Or is it a signaling that you want to signal to the others that you're a good person, a good reputation, and you distort your authenticity, use what you would do otherwise if there were no signal? And the outcome for that is 72%, I think, is actually, 44% thought it's extrinsic, 52% thought it's intrinsic, and 40% thought it's a signaling component. you can choose more than one option, so it doesn't add to 100%. And the third question was, with the emergence of social media, did you distort your self-authenticity more or less? And what's interesting is that I guess I was worried that they might not be very honest, but it's 72% agreed that they distort their self-authenticity. So they are very worried about the signaling component. So 72% now do more and 28% do less. And who should rule the public discourse? Who should design the rules and how we shape our public sphere? Should it be Facebook or Twitter or the big tech companies? Should it be parliaments or governments? Or should it be society at large? And only 5% think the tech companies should be it. And actually, it's also surprising that only 31% think the parliaments or governments should do it. But the majority, 65%, almost 2/3, think society at large should have a public debate and should actually decide and think this is an important topic. And today, we make our first attempt at it, and Jean will present his work. So Jean, the floor is yours. Thanks again for doing it, and we're looking forward to the presentation.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Markus. On this first slide, there is one piece of content which is important, except for Markus. It's work in progress, so you have to be very indulgent. And I apologize in advance for any of the shortcomings. Of course, you can use brain-to-brain links to give me some feedback during the talk. That will help quite a lot. It's part of a broader agenda. I'm trying to understand what we should be concerned about when platforms collect data about ourselves. I have another paper on the surveillance by the state or platforms using soft control bundling strategies to control people. There's a little bit of a social science fiction here. And we, of course, will need some experimental evidence to back up or infirm the theory. So let me move on. And okay, so let me start with an observation on the fact that our life is more and more exposed to public view. And by the way, the public sphere will just be the extension of visibility to a broader audience. So it's not the Habermas definition. It's going to be different. It's just more visibility of our behavior to others, which is going to possibly increase signaling incentives. And that's, of course, facilitated by the technological revolution, AI, facial recognition, data anxieties, like when you write about others or you post pictures of others and so on, then you give information about others. And this is not innocuous, of course. We know from experiments that we change our behavior when we observe by people whose judgment we value. So if we are observed by more people in general and we care about those people, then we are going to do more signaling, which also, the flip side of that is there is less authenticity. So you don't behave as much on the basis of what your preferences are, intrinsic and extrinsic, but also you try to build an image vis-a-vis other people, right? So the question we are going to ask is, how does it alter the nature of a social relationship? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? The thrust of the argument is that there is an inflation of the public sphere, and it's going to entail both a level and a composition effect. So behaviors that once belonged to the private sphere become observable to a larger audience, and presumably that may affect the private sphere. So, what remains of a behavior with a smaller audience. And the second thing is that the expansion of the public sphere is not random. Our social relationships are very biased, or at least the social relationships in the private sphere are very biased toward like-minded individuals and individuals who care about us and will be tolerant. So the expansion of the public sphere is doesn't just have a level effect, it also has a composition effect, because you are going to signal to different people compared to the private sphere. Now, let me come back to the lab and field evidence on the following, which is that when you give more visibility to a socially valued behavior, it makes it more prevalent. There are dozens of experiments that show exactly that. Now, in this paper, I'm going to argue that making a behavior more visible may not increase its frequency in environments that diverge from the ones which are used in experiments. And you can understand that from the two caveats in the statement above. The first is that you have one activity. So if you have multiple activities and you increase the visibility of one of the activities, you are going presumably to increase the prominence, the prevalence of that activity. However, it's also going to convey information about you, which is going to be exogenous information on other activities. And that may alter your signaling behavior in the other activity in this multitask context. The second caveat is that link with socially valued. Take a corrida or boxing event or slaughtering of an animal for religious reasons. Some people in the population are going to think it's a good thing. They are going to infer good traits like attachment to cultural roots, conviviality, while others will find the behavior completely repulsive. And you can apply that to many things like politics, religion, sexuality, and so on. So basically, those two caveats are going to define the two parts of the presentation. One on multitasking, the public versus the private sphere, which will have different signaling properties, and one on divisive behaviors. Next, just to paint the broad picture, I'm going to add a normative dimension with some assumed choices. So the consumption, my consumption, may exert an externality. I have to tell you right away that the externality here is a very conventional externality in economics. So an externality is inflicting harm on somebody, a nuisance, increasing the cost, etc., etc. You know, what you learn in undergrad, in undergraduate courses. By contrast, you have some behaviors which I will call victimless. Again, it's a bias of mine, but what my religion is, or my politics, or my sexual orientation is of a concern only to myself. There is no victim there. That's my assumption, at least. Next, the other dimension is what I'm trying to signal. So it could be an heterogeneous trait, which is vertical. So basically, everybody agrees that more is better. So being more altruistic is sort of as being better. So, if I care more about the environment and I pollute less, or if I'm against violence and I don't kick other people or whatever, then everybody will think it's a good thing, or most people. That's what I will call the consensual consumption, and that will be the first part of the talk. Or it could be an heterogeneous trait, something that people disagree upon, like religion or politics, sexuality, and so on. And that's what I will call a divisive consumption. And that will be part two. And I will just do the diagonal on this table. One entry has been studied a lot, that's the one in which there is no victim, but you try to signal a vertical attribute like wealth, and you try to, it's status consumption, conspicuous consumption, so Veblen, Pesendorfer, Bagwell, Bernheim, and so on. And the one I'm going to ignore is a mixed case where you have an horizontal attribute, but an externality. For technical reason, because in principle, you need a two-dimensional type, altruism and taste. But also, I believe it's a little bit less frequent than the ones on the diagonal, because if you have a very sizable externality, then the behavior becomes kind of consensual, that, exerting this externality is not good. Okay, so I'm going to forget about this mixed case. And the outline is clear from now. So I'll start with a consensual behavior with a single task. This single task, it will be a classic model. There will be nothing new. The behavior will be driven by reputational concern, but also by intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And you'll get exactly the standard result that if you give the behavior more visibility, that's going to make it more prevalent. Then I will move on to the multitask or multiple actions, some in the private sphere, which are observed by one person or a small number of persons, and other in the public sphere observed, say, by everyone. And presumably, if a behavior moves from private sphere to the public sphere, there will be better behavior in this public, when there is a move to the public sphere, because you have a bigger audience. And the question will be, what is the impact on the private sphere? And is it desirable socially? And then the second part will be on the divisive behaviors. I won't have time to discuss the related literature. There is a very big literature on posturing, privacy, signaling to multiple audiences, even in philosophy, of course, because authenticity, as Markus said, is playing a big role in philosophy. Usually it's associated with privacy. The idea is that you need privacy to be authentic. And it's often synonymous of emancipation. But we know, and actually the philosophers know as well, it's more ambiguous than that from the normative perspective. So if you have any literature you want to advise me, send me an email, please. So let me start. It's a theory paper, and let me start with a consensual behavior with a single task benchmark, a little bit like my model with Roland. It's a signaling model in which an agent may behave prosocially, AI equals 1, or not behave prosocially, AI equals 0. So AI equals 1 is prosocial. It generates some externality E on other people, but it's costly for the agent. C is a cost, so C is the extrinsic motivation. The intrinsic motivation of agent I is VI, which is distributed according to distribution F on R+. R+ is important, and it really means that it's a consensual behavior. So everybody is actually going to agree that actually a higher V is a good thing, because it means that you are more altruistic somehow. The utility of agent I will be a mixture of intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and image concern. So if you didn't answer the 3, you got it wrong. Sorry. So intrinsic motivation is how altruistic you are. So if you choose AI equals 1, you get some intrinsic pair of VI, but it induces a cost. And the important thing is the image concern. I'll call theta the intensity of image concern. And the image will be the perception of your VI conditioned on your image, because people don't observe your VI. They don't have access to your brain, not yet. So they infer your type from your behavior. Welfare will be slightly different. And this is a specific formulation of welfare. There are others. You can dispute this. You can have others. It doesn't matter. But this is really the simplest. Where welfare is basically VI minus C plus E, which is the externality onto other people, but we don't take into account the image term, because basically image is a zero-sum game, or what sociologists will call a positional good. By the law of iterated expectation, the expectation of V hat is equal to prior mean of V. So basically, that basically cancels out. And theta, of course, can be an average, because people may care differently about your type or your behavior. So, for example, theta might depend on the type of the receiver, of the audience. So, for example, theta could be the integral from 0 to infinity of theta of V df of V, where theta of V is an increasing function. I mean, that's a possibility. And privacy will be basically in this small. It's much less sophisticated and different from Habermas. It's basically a low theta. Okay. The privacy
so quick question about that the image is canceling out on aggregate, but can't we as a society all feel very good that we're all helping each other and everybody has a good image about the others? Is it important, or is it just a simplifying assumption?
Well, here it's just updating in a sense. You cannot avoid, if everybody behaves well, for example, then those who don't behave well look terrible. There is the bad apples, right? So basically the idea is that reputation is a zero-sum game, right? So it's relative to the others. Of course, we might want to be actually think that, and Holo and I have done some work on that, that actually we live in a nice society. So, you know, the distribution F is biased toward IV. So we live in a nice society where people are nice people for whatever reason. But here, you know, F, so there's nothing to be learned. If people didn't know F, that would be a bit different, I agree, because then there will be another term in terms of the impact on welfare. Okay, so in this very simple model, you select AI equals 1 if your intrinsic motivation is high enough, where basically your intrinsic motivation minus your extrinsic motivation plus your image benefit is equal to 0 for the cutoff type is indifferent. And the image benefit is, as usual, the difference between the glory and the stigma. So if you behave well, then people infer that your V is greater than V star. So you get a conditional mean M plus of V star. Whereas if you don't behave well, then people infer that your V is less than V star. We make a technical assumption that V star minus C plus theta of delta V star is increasing in V star just to guarantee uniqueness of V star. If image concerns are very large, you can have multiple behavior. And authenticity in this model is defined, it's basically the flip side of signaling. So it's a bit pompous in a sense, but it's basically the extent to which the cutoff, you are fully authentic if the cutoff is equal to the cost, which happens if there is no image concern. But if there are image concerns, the authenticity is less than 1, okay, and is actually decreasing in theta. Now, in terms of welfare, and that's also well known, so I'm going a little bit fast through that, an increase in authenticity, so a decrease in theta in a sense, a decrease in visibility is desirable, emancipating, if the anxiety is small. I mean, here it's just pure posturing, you don't do much for society. But if the anxiety is larger, which is the case we have in mind usually, is that it's undesirable. So let me move on to the part 1. The part 1 on multitasking, we need at least 2 actions for that, of course. Actually, we're going to take a continuum of actions, it doesn't matter. Each individual is going to be engaged in actions, say, with each other person, J, will be the counterparty, or it could be a group of people if you want. And you're going to choose AIJ in your relationship with J. In the case of the pride sphere, I will use S for silo, information silo. Only J learns the behavior. So in a pride sphere, you just learn. By the way, I hope we are in a pride sphere, so I can, following up on Markus' introduction, I can brainstorm without too much cost for me. So in the pride sphere, only J learns AIJ. In the public sphere, of course, it's really extreme. In the public sphere, and I use T for transparency, everybody learns the action, AIJ, okay? But, as I said, 2 or 3 actions will do the same. We are going to assume, given that preferences will be the same for each action, we are going to assume that the equilibrium is going to be deterministic and symmetrical. So basically, there will be only 2 actions taken, AS in the private sphere and AT in the public sphere. Okay, and there will be an equilibrium like that. Agent I will choose a behavior in the public sphere and a behavior in the private sphere. That's his payoff in the absence of reputation concern. So you get VI minus C. VI is the same for every interaction. So that's your altruism. Fraction T of your interactions are public, and then you get TAT in terms of contribution, and a fraction S, which is 1 minus T, is private. So you get SAS. Now, in terms of the image concern, what happens is that the people in the public sphere, they learn only one thing, which is a behavior in the public sphere, given that behavior with themselves is just AT as well. So you update just on the basis of AT. Whereas if you're on the private sphere, you observe what's happening in the public sphere as well as what's happening in the personal relationship with a person. Okay, so the updating will be based on AT and AS at the same time. And you see already from there that in the public sphere, you are going to affect your reputation with respect to people on the public sphere, but also in the private sphere, and that's going to play a very important role. So we're going to look for an equilibrium in which you have two cutoffs. Basically, the idea is that you are going to be, which is very intuitive, you are going to behave better in the public sphere than the private sphere. Okay, so that means the cutoff in the public sphere will be lower than the cutoff in the private sphere. So those types V here will behave well in both spheres. Those types V here will behave well only in public, and those will be behaving poorly anyway. Okay, and assuming they are interior, they are given by those two equations. So when you are indifferent between contributing in the private sphere or not, well, you take into account your intrinsic motivation, your image concern, and your image concern is only in the private sphere because by definition, the private sphere, your behavior is not observed outside. So if you contribute, your image is M plus of VS, but if you don't contribute, and that's the important thing, your image is not M minus of VS, it's the mean value of V given that VS is greater you are in between VS and VT. So the point is that you have separated yourself from the chaff. And in a sense, once you have done your job in the public sphere, you have less incentive to be nice in the private sphere because you can always say, look, I'm not a bad person. In the public sphere, you have some kind of cheap signaling thing, which is you score double. So you get VT minus C. If I divide everything by T, VT minus C plus T, M plus of VT minus M minus of VT, that's the delta of VT that we had before. But there is also a gain. So here, you also gain better image in the private sphere as well. So you score double in the public sphere. So the outcome basically is that there will be less contribution in the private sphere and more contribution in the public sphere. So that's the property of equilibrium. If T equals 0, so everything is private, or if T equals 1, everything is public, you get this V star, which is given by the star equation here. But once you start expanding the public sphere, so when T moves from 0 to 1, and first nothing happens for the public sphere because it's so cheap. If you have one behavior and you signal to 10 different audiences, then that's very cheap signaling, right? Nothing happens, everybody actually behaves well. But then, basically, you get less and less good behavior as the public sphere expands. So in terms of outcomes, first notice there is a misallocation of effort, which is I'm going to behave much better in the public sphere than in the private sphere. Second, public sphere is going to reduce prosociality in the private sphere. Okay, as I said, you already have separated yourself from the chaff. And there is a crowding out by the public sphere. So as the public sphere expands, when T increases, then it's going to basically be ambiguous. So actually, if you look, for example, at the uniform distribution, A bar of T is M-shaped. So first it increases and then it decreases. Okay, it's always the case that an increase in T over some range is going to decrease the expected contribution over the distribution f of V. So the outcome is that if you increase transparency in this multitask world, then that may not be desirable, even if there is too little prosocial behavior, even if you have a large externality. And that's contrary to what happens with a single action. So the multitask thing is very crucial for that. You don't get it otherwise.
So Jean, can I
Yes,
I know
please.
it's very different in a sense, but if Bengt Holmström's multitasking paper, the principal agent setting, you get at the end some similar, can you draw some analogies and differences? And the other question which came up.
I mean, in Bengt and Paul's paper, basically you, when you work harder on one task, then you work less on the other task, but it's more an effort substitution thing, which is that if I work more on one paper, I'll have less time, I will be more tired to work on the other paper, right? Here it's entirely based on reputations. So it's a different form of crowding out, but it takes place basically on the image side and not on the cost side.
The other question which came up is if you were the private sphere, if it's only private with a certain probability, and let's say 80% it stays private, 20% it becomes public, does it change? Probably it goes through the same way. There's no new insight from making it probabilistic.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. There's no change. Actually, I took an extreme assumption that actually the private sphere is observed only by the people you interact with, and the public sphere is observed by everyone. The important thing is basically the public sphere, when the public sphere expands, and there are activities which are observed by more people. That's what's needed for the result. Okay.
Thanks.
Then let me move on to the other topic, which is also going to turn the conventional wisdom on its head, which is divisive behavior. So there we are going to depart from consensual behaviors and assume that people disagree on what is moral or immoral, right or wrong. Okay. So we are going to assume that people are values V, but you cannot, it's going to be a taste as opposed to altruism, something like that, which is a more vertical trait. So it's going to be a taste parameter. It's going to be distributed again according to some distribution f of V, and it's going to be private information, but it's going to be distributed on R. So there will be negative V's and positive V's as opposed to R plus. And actually, we are going to assume that F is symmetric around 0 for tractability. And we are going to measure the lack of consensus. So first, let me notice that having F symmetrical in a sense maximizes disagreement in a sense. You know, people are agree on both sides. But then you can compare symmetric distributions by looking at rotation. So you can index the distribution f of v by a parameter rho. So a rotation index, I mean, given that the mean is going to stay 0, so it's a specific form of mean preserving spread. There's a single crossing. So the rotation index basically increases the CDF for V negative and decreases it for V positive, and it has been used many times in the literature. But basically, it's a polarization thing. The distribution is more spread out. So the social approval. So that's part of the way I formalize things. So basically, an action, and maybe I should talk about the action first. Action will be -1, 0, 1, because I want some kind of symmetric model there. You can be part of a left-wing party or a right-wing party. You can be from one religion or another, or being agnostic or whatever. And what people think will depend on their own type, on their own trait. So left-wing people will like left-wing people better, right-wing people will like right-wing people better. So that's basically the idea. And theta will be theta of Vj, which is the image concerned vis-a-vis Vj will be a function which is first negative and then positive. It's going to be symmetrical, I should say anti-symmetrical. So it's an odd function, and it's going to be increasing. The image will remain a zero-sum game, positional good. And the action will be -1, 0 or 1. So you can act. So I can go to a meeting of the left or a meeting of the right. And that will entail a cost, C, which is positive or 0. But I also may do nothing at all. So I just can stay neutral in some way. And as you might expect, the moderates, the ones who are close to 0, are the ones who are most likely to choose action 0. Now the payoff is this. So the payoff, and there's a slight difference with what we had before. So there's still intrinsic motivation, which is VI times AI. Then, as I said, the cost will be incurred whenever I act. So if I choose AI equals -1 or 1. And then my image concern, so I'm going to have image V hat Ji vis-a-vis individual J. So individual J will assign type, updated type V hat Ji about me, okay? And we'll put a weight theta Vj on that. So if I'm a left-wing person, I don't want to signal I'm to a right-wing person because this person will disapprove of it. But I want to signal to a left-wing person, okay, for example. Now, the assumed choice, and again, it's an assumption, is that AI equals 0 or 1 is a victimless behavior. So we are in a case where the externality is equal to 0. And usually when the externality is 0, that's the case where privacy is optimal, or small privacy is optimal because it gets rid of superfluous signaling and it emancipates the individual, right? Do you have any question about this this slide?
No, no question on this one. Looks all, I think, well.
Okay.
Understood.
So I'm going to start by assuming that privacy is going to be determined entirely by the activity you pick. And it's going to be observed by the agent who chooses the same action. So the non-action, if you don't do anything, it's not going to be observed by anyone. You cannot prove that you didn't act. But if you act, then you'll be observed by your in-group or your peers. So if you go to a church, if you go to a corridor boxing event or a club or a political party or something like that, then the people who will observe your behavior are your peers. I mean, or mainly your peers. Of course, it doesn't have to be entirely your peers. The important thing is that it's biased towards your peers. It's a kind of safe space where when you enter this activity, you'll be basically seen by people who are like-minded. And it's a strong assumption, but I think it captures in a very stark form the idea that social relationships are biased toward like-minded individuals, okay? And that's why there will be a composition effect. So if you expand the set of people who watch your behavior, then it's not only going to be more public, but also it's going to basically be communicated. Your behavior is going to be communicated to people who are less keen on your behavior than the ones who observe it usually, right? So once you leave the safe space, you are going to have your behavior observed by people who are going to be less tolerant of it. Okay, so we are going to look for an equilibrium. It's going to look very much the same as before in terms of techniques, but of course the model is different. I'm going to call, by incentive compatibility, there will be cutoffs. So below V minus, you'll choose A equals -1. Above V plus, you'll be choosing A equals 1. And in between, you'll choose A equals 0. So it will be monotonic. It has to be the case. And theta V plus will be basically the weight you put on your image vis-a-vis the in-group. So basically, say, for example, if you choose A equals 1, the people who are going to observe your behavior are the people with a V which is greater than V plus. And basically, you're going to put weight the integral from v plus to plus infinity of theta of v df of v. Theta of v is an odd function, while delta is actually an even function. Okay. Now, under this assumption of activity contingent visibility, you care only about signaling to your in-group, because the out-group anyway won't be able to tell apart AI equals 1 to AI from AI equals 0. So it's not going to change the updated beliefs for them. You are going to change the beliefs only of the in-group. Okay, questions?
Can you just explain odd function even? What do you mean odd function?
Okay,
Delta is even?
So theta of minus v equals minus theta of v. I don't know if it's the right term or it's anti-symmetric or when theta of minus v is equal to minus theta of v, I think it's an odd function, but I may be wrong.
Oh, okay.
Whereas an even function is basically delta of v is equal to delta of minus v.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so the equilibrium has to be symmetrical. Actually, you can show that. V plus is equal to minus V minus, and let's call Vs. I'm going to use S for silo because I'm going to take privacy as meaning you are in a safe space. You are only with your in-group, you with your peers. In that case, your behavior is going to be, the cutoff is going to be dictated by intrinsic motivation Vs minus cost, which is C, which is extrinsic motivation, plus the image concern vis-a-vis your in-group. And in your in-group, you show them that your V is greater than Vs, whereas otherwise you'll show them that V is less than Vs. So remember that delta is equal to M plus minus. M minus is the difference between glory and stigma. And authenticity is less than 1 simply because it's exactly the same formula as before. It's less than 1 simply because you are going to try to impress your in-group, okay? Now, under transparency, so let's assume now that your behavior is observed by all, okay? Then you have no image concern. But that's due to the symmetry, of course, but you have no image concerns because if you choose A equals 1, then you're going to please the right-wing people, but you're going to displease the left-wing people. Anyway, in the end, it's going to be a zero-sum game. So in that case, interestingly, you get authentic behavior. So basically, image concerns don't play a role anymore, and then you'll contribute if and only if your intrinsic motivation is greater than the cost, your extrinsic motivation. So A is equal to 1. So you see, it's different from consensual behavior, because for consensual behavior, you get more authentic behavior when you have privacy than when you have transparency, and here you get exactly the reverse. Okay.
So Charlie Kahn has a question, which is a bigger picture question in a sense that he said, okay, so some of the utility in the real world comes not from the approval of the in-group, but from the enjoyment of outraging those whose preferences are different. Can you capture that? How would you capture that in your framework?
Sorry, it doesn't come from the in-group, but from?
That you outrage the out-group, essentially.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. And it can be. You can take pleasure in being a rebel, and then presumably you want to make your behavior transparent, right?
Yes.
And please don't tell my family I'm a nice person. No, I mean this is actually good. I mean you could add that to the model. It's not in the model at this stage.
Okay.
Actually, it's a reverse. You don't want people to think badly of you. And therefore, you try to hide your sexuality or your religion or whatever from your colleagues because you know they may not approve of that or something like that. That will be so. But it's interesting. I mean, the other case will be. But then you need a different image concerns, and that's actually interesting as well. Now, here it's spontaneous. You go to the church, you go to the political party or to a gay club or whatever, then the people who observe your behavior are your peers, okay? But what if it's not the case? So I have a section where I can show that if your behavior is observed by no one, but you can disclose it in terms of hard information in a repository, and then the outcome of that is going to be exactly the same. So basically, the people who choose A equals 1 are going to regroup themselves in a single repository, a right-wing repository or left-wing repository. So they will recreate this safe space. So it may not be that interesting except from a theoretical perspective. Sorry, I missed one. Okay. I forgot to say that welfare is higher under transparency here. And I will take that back in a minute, actually. But it's true that here you have no externality and you have authenticity under transparency. So clearly transparency is first best. But let me take that back immediately, because if you imagine that the status quo is full transparency, so everybody can communicate your behavior on Facebook and so on and so forth. So you have not only in-group transparency, but you also have out-group transparency. But you can pay a hiding cost. So you can actually make sure that you can only the information is going to be available only to in-group, either because you are going to a safe space or because you enter one of those repositories of information. But there is a cost of doing that. So this cost of doing that, what I have in mind is, for example, sexual minorities which cannot enjoy public space together. There's a clear cost for that. I mean, there used to be in a number of countries, that may be the case still today in some countries. Not using one's freedom of speech because you are worried that there will be people who will not like you because of that. Or if you're a drug user, for example, if abortion is prohibited, for example, then you might actually resort to costly and untrustworthy suppliers. So there's a cost of hiding your type, your behavior, and making it seen only by your peers. And then you get back to the same kind of equation. At least there are some assumptions which are needed for that. You can do it more generally. So basically, the cutoff will be given by this, except instead of 0, you'll have the adding cost. But now you will have a deadwood which is created by the fact that the status quo is full transparency. So if you allow people to tweet and put information about your political opinions and your sexuality and so on, and your religion, or the newspaper to print that, then you'll do everything you can to make sure that your ad group doesn't learn about it, and there will be a hiding cost which will be non-negligible. In that case, of course, you want to preserve privacy. I have a small note at the end of the paper, which is not on divisive behavior, but has exactly the same consequences as divisive behavior. So I go back to the consensual behavior of the start. So everybody agrees that altruism is good. But what is unknown is not my absolute altruism, but whether I like X better than Z, right? So the issue is not whether I'm a good person or not, but who are my preferred, my favorites in the group. And then there is competition in the group because there is limited attention. So you can formalize this as a distribution, same thing, of altruisms, but the question is whether you are someone for whom I care a lot, my VZ is high or is low. And of course, if you have limited attention, you like me to be high VZ, you to be a high VZ person, right? And you get the formula, which is basically the same under silo information, and under transparency, you get actually more honest behavior, more authenticity. Now, it's very much the same as for that divisive issue. I mean, you may not see this. I'm sorry, I'm putting too much stuff on the slides here, but basically it's like divisive issue, which is what is good news for someone is going to be turn out to be bad news for others. Okay, and actually, you know, for example, when you have transparency, if I'm being nice to everyone, then you won't learn that actually I like you, right? So you get something which is very close to the previous one. So let me conclude, and I may have taken a little bit long. The conventional wisdom is that on the positive side, increase visibility of a consensual action, then it's going to increase the prevalence of this action. On the normative side, if you increase visibility, that's good. If you have a big anxiety, it's bad if you have a small one. And you turn those conclusions on their head in broader context, either because you are multitasking, increase visibility for a task, crowds out signaling incentives for less visible tasks, and the increased visibility may reduce the average social contribution. And on the divisive behavior front, privacy in the sense of a safe space, basically being watched by the in-group, leads to less authenticity, but it can still be good because if the default is transparency, then people will spend resources going back to privacy, and there will be possibly substantial hiding costs. Now, given that I'm not done with the paper, and again, I apologize for that, it's a bit too early to talk about future research, but you know, there are things which are important. One actually is connected to what Markus said, which is that sometimes we value privacy because we can throw ideas around without without looking stupid. And I saw the number of people listening to that talk makes me worried. Actually, I was kind of hoping 10 people, a small group that will be very tolerant toward my shortcomings. But anyway, but you know, more generally, it's easier to let us team. By the way, if you think about Habermas, I'm not completely sure. Actually, sometimes to build a consensus, you have to start in small groups where you can throw ideas, not piss off people, try to understand what makes people tick and learn new things. But this is not in the paper. There are also costs of privacy which are not in the paper, like ghettoization of thinking. Of course, you know, if we're only in a safe space, and that number of people have written about this for the US universities, but also now in Europe. If we only with our peers, only with the in-group, then thinking is being ghetto-sized. What do you say? Turned into a ghetto. So those are areas for research which I unfortunately don't touch in that work. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jean. Can I just throw a few questions at you further? So the one question from Sanjeev Kumar is, if you were to introduce uncertainty about your own authenticity self, would it change anything if we just take the certain equivalent in a sense?
Well, if you didn't know your type, in a sense, it will not be clear what you'll be signaling. Basically, you're trying to signal that you're a nice person, or you're right-wing person, or whatever you are trying to signal, or not to signal. But somehow you must know your type, otherwise it's very, very hard to be signaling. I mean, yes. You could always write an Holmström type model in which you don't know your type, and then your type still influences the outcome. But yes. I think it's more reasonable for talent somehow. But you may disagree with that. I don't know.
Some other questions which came up is that you can design it. Of course, should Twitter design how much we can join a group or not join a group? Or should the user design? I mean, of course, if the user moves, it immediately creates a signal. But so the whole design question, perhaps you can go a little bit. I found it very interesting that you went back to Habermas saying, okay, you want to have a process where you start in a smaller group, and then, once you feel more comfortable figuring something out, you're more bold to signal something. Of course, this goes way beyond your model, but it would be nice to speculate a little bit in that direction.
Just let me step back one moment about not knowing one's type. I mean, there's a work on identity where you try to prove yourself, and we have done some work with Roland that, and other people have worked on that as well, where you try to convince yourself you have a certain type. So maybe there will be something to be done along those lines. So let me qualify a little bit what I said earlier. But or Twitter, should Twitter decide which group I'm going to? I don't know. I mean, it all depends. You know, you may be following Trump because you are interested in the latest thing he's going to say. I'm being polite here. But you know, in general, of course, you know, the kind of group you join, it says a lot about you, and that's one of the reasons also why employers should not be, or governments or employers should not have the right actually to ask you for your Facebook private account. But you know, still there's something about clubs, right, which can be good too. I mean, and you know, that's something I've done some work with following Moisson and lots of other people have worked on that as well, which is, you know, there is also an homophilia benefit. So, you know, if I like rugby, I just don't want to join an American football club, right? I prefer to join a rugby club and so on. So sometimes basically joining a club of like-minded people is actually anyway a good thing socially. The question is when it becomes a more divisive question. So, you know, you may not think differently of me if I join a rugby group rather than American football group. But you know, for other things, you may update your beliefs about me, and that's different. And sure, there will be no updating if Twitter shows a group I belong to, but that would be strange, right?
Yeah, but that might make it easier, more difficult for certain followers. That might highlight certain things or whatever.
Yeah.
But so let's conclude with a final question for researchers and PhD students who are thinking and going in this area. Do you have any advice for PhD students saying, okay, this really the privacy issues and this area is really important to figure out also in connection with digital economy? Is there any particular advice you would give PhD students who, you know, searching around which topic to work on, and to what extent they should reach out even to psychology and philosophy? And also, is it very important to be cross-disciplinary in this area?
Well, I want them to give me advice. But no, I mean, privacy is a very rich field. So it's true that in economics, we have worked a lot on what you mentioned at the start. It's well developed on capturing rents. You know, the platform learns about you, your willingness to pay. That has some benefits in terms of matching, but also some big costs in terms of capture of surplus and so on. So that's something we understand better and better. Now, there are other dimensions which are more like psychological and sociological dimensions of privacy we understand less well. And there, I think we need to do two things. I mean, we need to try to understand why we are worried about privacy. You know, there's the usual privacy paradox, which I don't think is really a paradox. I mean, when I'm very concerned about my privacy, but when I'm on the web, I click all the time, 20 times a day, because I don't have time. I just don't understand anything towards those things there. It's very opaque. Sometimes I don't even know whether I've refused or accepted. It's so opaque. So on that front, I think we need much more regulation, and because I keep, even with GDPR, I keep clicking like mad, just like I was doing before, even so I'm concerned about my privacy. So I'm not sure there's a privacy paradox, so to speak, but still, you know, there are things we worry about, and we don't know that much about it. So, of course, you know, the economists are a little bit late in the game because philosophers, as you mentioned, have discussed that for a long time. But I think we have apparatus to try to formalize that, and also we have experiments to run. So, you know,
there's one question, if I can.
There are lots of experiments to run, which I hope people will run to try to see. and of course, we'll have lots of real life experiments we are going to suffer through, and we have no choice. Right? But
I said it was the last question, but let me just, because you mentioned it, as economists, we have some tools, but one question is, how would you measure privacy empirically? So if you move beyond your theory outlines, you would like to capture it empirically, would you go for experiments or field experiments, or what would be the way to approach it?
Well, I mean, we don't have a good definition of privacy. In this paper, I take a specific one, which is, you know, more people observe my behavior, so there's less privacy in that case. But then there are questions about the information you communicate. So, you know, let's say the employer comes and sees you, Markus, and say, Markus, can you show me your private Facebook page? You don't have to, by the way. You are entirely free not to do it, right?
Yeah.
Now, is that privacy? I will say, well, legally, yes, it's privacy, but this will not be privacy to me because of the unraveling phenomenon that will take place in that case, right? So we need, I think privacy is much more complex than what I have in these notes, right? It's much broader than that. And we need to think in a much broader way, I think.
So lots of work to be done also for PhD students and other researchers. And I think we had a conference in Princeton in February. I think you gave the keynote some while back and before COVID. And so we're expecting, hopefully there will be a lot of more research coming. Thanks a lot for the nice talk, and hope we stay in touch. We see each other soon in the real world again.
Yes.
And thanks again. Talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.